see that?
Yep.
Excellent. So in the Greens, we've come up with a vision for what the Thoroughbred racetrack site could be, and I think everybody here will know the background of that one really, really well. We're in a world now where we've been half funding that racetrack. The Canberra Public has been paying for half the operating expenses of that for some time under MOU funding. The racetrack has actually now asked government if they could redevelop it. The district planning process slated this area for redevelopment for a whole lot of reasons. And so it's a really good time to be looking at what should we do with this site and what's in the best interests of Canberra. So the Greens have been thinking about this one. Now it's been the home of horse racing for 60 years. Life's changed a lot in that time. I think back in 1961, when they were given the site, there was a bit of a different status of horse racing in the community than there is now. We've pledged and given them over $100 million under this MOU funding over the last decade. So they get about $8 million a year. They get that outside any public tender or grant. It's more than we give the Brumbies, the Raiders, the Canberra Capitals, Canberra United combined. It's a lot of money, and it's clearly not enough to make them viable. They're in an industry that is simply no longer viable. The Greens have opposed that MOU funding, but I think what's happening now is we're now at the point where they've decided that they would like to become property developers to make some more money because they can't run a viable racetrack in the current conditions. So they have been working on plans for redevelopment, and I think they've presented to this council those plans. The plans contain housing, which is great. So their plans have got around 3,200 dwellings in there. My take on that is that they have got a plan that is a racetrack with some apartments on the side, and we reckon we could do better. The government, Andrew Barr, has set up a steering committee to have a look at the Thoroughbred Park plans. I asked in Parliament the other week who was on that. The committee is made up of senior government officials and the racing industry, and they are only tasked with looking at Thoroughbred Park's plans at the moment. And we think it would be much better if they took a much broader picture and looked at what could the entire site be, particularly given that the planning directorate actually put out two versions in their original district plans. They put out one version with the racetrack and one version without. So clearly a lot of people in Canberra are thinking about what we should do with that entire site. It's a really big site. This is a huge decision to make, and it's a really long-term one. We're making decisions for the next 50 or 100 years. It's 64 hectares. It's pretty flat. It's a good place to develop. You would need to do the studies. You would need to do the environmental studies, the tree studies. But given how developed the land is already, we are all assuming that it is probably pretty good for development. It's right on light rail, and it's got 2 light rail stops. This, of course, matches up with all of the progressive planning in this town for Yonkers, which has said we should do transport-oriented development, and this is transport-oriented development. This is absolutely where we should be putting it. 5Ks from Civic, really, really well located. And yes, the original district strategies actually did have 2 versions, a redevelopment with a racetrack and a redevelopment without a racetrack, but the redevelopment without the racetrack seems to have fallen off by the wayside. This, which I won't spend too long on because I imagine everybody here has seen this. This is the Canberra Racing Club proposal, and I think this council's had a good chance to look at this and probably had a presentation from the industry on this one. So it's basically they would put some housing and facilities around the outside. They would upgrade and retain the racetrack. They'd do a bit of work to, make some nicer facilities on the inside. And that would be their vision for the site. We went off and we hired some architects. We hired Munsly Moore to have a little look at this, and we sort of gave them a clean slate. And we said, given all of the problems Canberra's facing at the moment, and given what this site is and where is it, what could we do that would be really, really in the interest of the public. And this is obviously just a first cut, but we think it is pretty amazing and a much, much better use of land. So this plan here, it's between 4,000 and 5,400 homes. The exact amount would depend on the exact constitution of those homes. We, in the Greens, we like to think about what people need rather than just thinking about what developers want to build right this second to make money. And of course, if you have this many people, you actually need to give them facilities. So with the population, you're talking about 10,000 people living there. We would put in schools. The schools in the area, in the surrounding region, are already pretty full. And we've got a growing population. So we actually think if you're going to build that many homes, even if you're going to build 3,000 homes on the racetrack version, you're going to need some schools for the kids. We would like to do a whole lot more with the site than that. There's some really exciting ideas coming around at the moment about renaturalizing Sullivan's Creek, and you could make this amazing wildlife corridor down here with a lot of green space and trees. It'd be a really, really good recreational area that people can go and walk to and sit and read, and that would be really beautiful. If you design it right and do your studies well, that's a really, really good flood catchment. As we move into a time of climate change, you can make sure that that is done really, really well to try and manage your water flows. We've got a whole lot of other facilities in here. We've got some commercial stuff here. People need, cafes and shops. We assume they'd like to do something other than stand and look at a racetrack. And we've got a whole mix of things in here. We've got an environment sustainability hub. We haven't put a name on that, but the sorts of things I think about are things like repair cafes, street pantries, those sorts of things. We've got art studio space. A lot of our artists constantly tell me that they need studio space and they need it for short-term leases and it needs to be subsidised. So you could have something like that. There might be, you go in and have artist talks and you can have people making art on site. And we've thought about all of the green spaces that people would need. We've got some gathering places in between. This is the sort of development that we like in the Greens, where you have apartments and townhouses around really big shared green spaces in the middle. So everybody effectively gets a backyard and it's a shared backyard. And we've got lots of parks in there and it's all walkable and rideable. So it's on light rail. You can walk through, you'd have paths all the way through and cycling all the way through. And you've got light rail right there. So it's sort of the utopian way of building from the start, of actually thinking through everything that people need and putting it in there from the beginning. We've got a few concept photos from the architects. They had a lot of fun sort of putting this together of what the area might look like. We think it is really important to do this kind of planning now. We know that Canberra's growing. We know that we've had this really piecemeal, developer-led, profit-led development in the past, and we actually think it's really important to put together entire neighbourhoods and to provide all of the amenity that people need. We also think it's really important that we have a lot more public housing and community housing. So we would put 10% public housing and 10% community housing in there. I didn't hear any mention of those from the racing industry when they were talking about their plans for the last 2 years, but I have in recent weeks heard them say that they would put some public housing in theirs too. So that now seems to be a feature of theirs. But we think probably we could manage 20%, and that's, Leon, where we can put quite a lot of our public and social housing, I think, that we need. And we would want to have a real community focus here. We would want to have a lot of gathering places to make sure that we are putting together a neighbourhood that has the ability to form really good connections and get along really well. I think I've probably run through most of these things. I think probably the key question that we've heard, I think mostly we're socialising this idea around Canberra at the moment. It's getting a really good reception, and we've got a big map with some photos that we're taking around on an easel and showing people. I think the big question we're getting is, would that mean the end of racing in this region? The easiest answer there is the Queanbeyan racetrack is 20 kilometres away. It's quite surprising that we have 2 racetracks within 20 k's in this small region. So we sort of feel, given that the ACT racetrack is clearly not viable without a massive public subsidy, there's probably there's easy access for horse racing for anybody in this area who wants it. I think the bigger issue is if we allow this industry-led plan to go ahead, we're missing the opportunity to make a really, really good neighbourhood. And what we're just going to get is a bunch of poorly thought through apartments with no amenity around a racetrack. And I can see that it's a huge lost opportunity on this land right in the heart of our city. And I can also see it causing social problems down the track. The next steps are a little bit less clear. We have flushed this issue out in Parliament, and we have made sure that we've got some information on the public record that wouldn't otherwise have been on record. There's a steering committee formed that we're not part of and don't have visibility over. We have written to the Chief Minister and asked that this option also be considered, and that the steering committee look at all options that are in the interest of the community rather than simply responding to one industry-led option. I did ask the Chief Minister when public consultation would occur, and he answered it would occur at some point in the future. So I guess that was good to get a commitment that there might be some public consultation. I'm not quite sure what form that would take. Our very strong view in the Greens is that that should be genuine public consultation to inform a decision, not consultation after a decision has been taken. We're pretty concerned about the way this process is unfolding, and we're also pretty concerned. We've got a very strong clear now that Canberra doesn't want to half fund the racetrack, and we've had very, very clear pushback from 3 and 4 Canberrans don't want to be giving $8 million to them every year. We reckon their $2 billion development, if you upzone the land to allow them to do that, that's probably the equivalent of handing them a windfall gain of a few $100 million. And we're not sure why Canberra would want to hand that over to the industry. So that is also concerning us. So we want to make sure that the site benefits the community by serving the needs we have for housing, public housing, and really, really good climate-friendly transport options, and a really, really good neighbourhood that we need for the growing population. And we also want to make sure that the benefits, the financial benefits of property development are being returned to the public purse, not being handed over to an industry. And Jochen, I reckon that might do me for now. I might try and close this and we might kick over to questions. How does that sound?
Thanks heaps, Joe. Any questions? Leon.
Yeah, this site is, if it's 64 hectares, that's about 1/6 the area of Watson. It seems to me that you're not going to be able to make this a viable suburb, and that everybody in that suburb is going to have to leave the suburb to buy their everyday groceries and things, to get their kids to primary school and to get to work. Is there any way of joining this up with somewhere else and making a viable suburb?
It's in an area already with a lot of housing, but I would say we've got schools in there. Like there are schools in there, so kids would not have to leave the site to go to school. They could walk without crossing any roads. They would walk straight to the school. In terms of shops, there is a commercial. There's the section right next to light rail is the commercial section. I wouldn't imagine that would be like a mega mall, and I don't quite know what would be in there. There would definitely be some hospo in there. You wouldn't have 10,000 people there without cafes and restaurants and things. You probably would get a mix of commercial. But other than that, I think when it comes to leaving for other things, you're on light rail. So in a lot of ways, it would actually be a lot easier to catch a couple of stops down or up to Gungahlin to get to the other places you need. But I would say it would be more medium density, more higher density than somewhere like Watson. So 10,000 people is a fair chunk of people. We've got 10,000 people in Belconnen CBD. I think that is kind of a suburb, so you need to build the infrastructure for a suburb.
Marcus?
There's also down the middle of the site, there's a fairly dense mixed use zone, which has got commercial underneath, and that leads off into a health precinct. So there's quite a bit of community facilities provided in that complex.
Thanks, Peter. Marcus? Marcus is gone. Marianne.
Oh, thank you, Joe. That was terrific. I'm just wondering too, in terms of facilities, I really love the idea. Could there be a community battery? So it's all electric and the battery, you know, I don't want to bring in Teslas, people, but don't like that, man. But you know what I mean? I'd love to see that. I just wondered too whether building standards could be really at the top level of climate change adaptation. And I hope there's going to be enough, if this goes ahead, enough room for big canopied trees. Questions?
Great questions. We haven't thought about a community battery. This would be an excellent place to have a community battery. We've already thought through EV charging infrastructure. You'd definitely want that. I reckon it would be fantastic to have really good building standards. Rebecca Vasarati's already introduced 7-star building standards, but this would be the sort of place that could go further. And one of the questions that's come up, because it's close to Epic, you would want really good building standards for noise insulation. We've made sure the schools are closest to where the music would be. So actually the people in this area would probably have a better time than those in Downer and Watson, but you would build it from the start with the view that you're going to have really good insulation for climate and also for noise. So it's prime, absolutely prime for that. And yes, deep-rooted zones, big canopy trees. That would be all through the site. And also we would have that wildlife corridor along Sullivan's Creek.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Marcus.
Yes, sorry, I forgot to unmute myself last time. Yeah, thanks for that presentation, Joe. I've had a look at this and I think I pretty much agree with everything you've just said. I've been in Canberra for the last 25 years and I don't think I've ever visited the racetrack. Not to say it doesn't have some value, but that's just my personal experience. I think the plan that you've come up with is light years ahead of anything I've seen from any property developers in the ACT since I've been looking at planning issues. And pretty much everything that I could think of that I'd like to see in a suburb, you've got in there. So well done with the plan that you've come up with. My first question is, why isn't the planning minister coming up with these sorts of plans? I mean, we had a 4-year planning review and it produced, you know, hundreds of pages of documents, which based on the responses and comments that were received on that, I don't think anyone thinks it's a perfect system or anyone thinks it's great where we ended up. And what we need is exactly what you've produced, a clear map setting out, you know, the various zones and the various restrictions and creating a great sort of livable suburb. So this is exactly what we need. And this type of map should be incorporated into the territory plan. This is exactly what we need. So, I mean, I don't know what we've been doing with the planning review for the last 4 years, when you can come up with something that is light years better than what's occurred over the last 4 years. So just having said that, I did have a couple of very small sort of thoughts based on your plan, whether you want to incorporate these or not. I noticed you had a, what do you call it, a community hall, number 13, which looked a bit off to the side and a little bit sort of on the outskirts. I wonder if that could be incorporated more into the centre of the sort of the suburb so it gets a little bit more use. One of the main roads you've got going down the centre of the suburb with the mixed use. I'm not sure exactly how you envisage that, but if that could be made into a sort of a mall type environment that you know, prioritizes walking rather than vehicles, that would be great. And you know, whether pedestrians have right of way or whether you limit the speed limit down to 40 kilometers an hour or even less, I think that would be a good addition. I also vaguely mentioned someone saying that around this area or near this area was prone to flooding risk. I don't know if you've thought about that, but it's just something that you may want to keep in mind if you haven't considered that already. And I also had the thought about a community battery that Marianne brought up. I think this would be great if all these roofs could be covered with solar panels and, you know, you had a community battery and, you know, with the aim of this being completely energy neutral, or perhaps even an energy exporter. Whether that would add a whole lot of complication, I don't know, but I think it'd be great to sort of at least try and get that happening, because battery technology has gotten to a point where it's sort of becoming mainstream now. So if you can incorporate it, that would be great. And finally, just one final point I wanted to make was that what you've done here, I think, is great. But there are many other sites around in the inner north and around Canberra more generally that are in this exact same position, where you've got golf courses or football ovals or racetracks, and these sites have been granted to sporting clubs generally at a pretty reduced rate, and now they've realized they're sitting on gold mines, and they want to take this opportunity to become property developers, as you said. So I think it's a great plan, what you've come up with, and yeah, it's the best I've seen in planning in the ACT. So thanks very much.
Thank you. I'm not going to respond to all of that, but that's great feedback, and we will incorporate it. The flood risk is a good and genuine concern. We'd need to do really good studies in this area, because this was built on a floodplain. I'm pretty sure with well-informed studies, you can build your renaturalized Sullivan's Creek in the right way to manage that risk, but it has to be done really carefully. And that's going to have to be done with any redevelopment that goes ahead there anyway.
As with Kenny. Ernestine?
Thank you, Jochen. I would like to endorse everything that Marcus just said. I agree entirely that this is a fantastic plan. I really would just like to try and understand the ownership aspect of this piece of land, and I may have missed something, and I apologise if it's already been said and I just didn't understand. But the racecourse, the organisation has a lease which gives them the right to use the land, but I really struggle in the same way that Marcus just said with understanding why community sporting groups have the right to use the land, but suddenly they have the right to sell the land. And I may have missed something here, but it really doesn't sit well with me that this is land that, as far as I can see, belongs to the ACT government, and yet private developers are making a profit by developing it on the behalf of sporting organisations. And that really doesn't sit well with me when we desperately need the sorts of housing in particular that you are proposing here, which is not happening because these private developers make a profit out of very expensive housing, which no one can afford.
No, yeah, the racing industry doesn't like me very much. They've asked me to stop talking about luxury apartments. So I started talking about apartments, but let's be frank, they're not going to be affordable ones. So the site at the moment, Canberra Racing Club has the lease. They got the lease in 1961. If I can remember, £250, I think. I can't quite remember what the figure was. We got it under FOI. The land is not urban zoned land at the moment, so nobody can put any dwellings or development there except, a racetrack and some sheds,
It's
unless
Broadacre.
government
It's
upzones.
Broadacre.
Sorry, Broadacre, yeah.
Broadacre.
Unless government upzones the land, government has to make a proactive decision to upzone the land before anybody can develop on it. So it's within the control of government. Which is why we're saying, well, if you're going to make that decision, let's stop and think about what is in the community interests to make that decision, and then do what's in the community interests. We would anticipate that government would try to, if government wanted to redevelop it, that government would try to purchase the land back. That would be the simplest way through. Government could also do a compulsory acquisition on just terms. Governments do that. We'll all remember Calvary, but there's actually been 7 or 8 of them in the last few years. It's the thing that government does quite regularly. One way or another, government can get the land back to use for community purposes if they choose to make that decision. And they're going to have to make a decision anyway, because nobody's developing there unless it gets upzoned.
Yep. Okay, thank you. So ownership is not settled until the zoning is settled. But somehow, because of the zoning, ownership goes to the racecourse.
There's a pathway through. Basically, if government chooses to upzone and redevelop, government could do that, or government could choose to upzone and hand a windfall gain over to the racing industry, and they could develop it. That's basically your 2 choices.
And that's the bit that
Can
Thank you for explaining.
Can I just follow up on Ernestine here? there was an interesting comment by Andrew Barr in the flurry of weird reactions to your launching of this plan. And that was that he said it would be difficult to claim a public purpose or public good for the government to reclaim that land. And so that argument is really interesting, because I would think that affordable housing, urban densification is a huge public good for Canberra. So governments seem to be able to reclaim land for roads or whatever, and transmission lines, but not for urgently, desperately needed housing. So how can that be?
Jochen, you're right that it was an interesting comment. I haven't spent too much time worrying about that comment. There are two ways government can get this land. They can negotiate to buy it.
How much would that be?
Sorry, how much? I haven't put a price on it. I wouldn't put a price on it. What I would, the horse racing industry thinks that they will make a lot of money from redeveloping the land, and I tend to agree with them. We don't agree on many things. I think they're right. I think government would also equally make money from redeveloping that land. So I'm not too, you need to get down into a commercial process, but I'm not too worried about purchasing the land. Like the value of developing it would far outstrip what you pay for it. There is compulsory acquisition on just terms. We've had a quick look at the legislation. There's nothing that would preclude it from here. And we've looked at, the 7 or 8 times in the last decade where government's done that. I imagine it would, it's definitely a pathway. There's some interesting things under the new Planning Act that we have now about territory priority projects. This wouldn't be a territory priority project, but we've gone through quite a lot of thinking about what is in the public interest. And I think the thinking we've done is very much along your lines, Jochen, that certain scales of public and affordable housing probably is in the public interest. So I suspect that might have been a rapid comment, and I wouldn't invest too much stress in that rapid comment.
Okay. Just a follow-up on this. You allocated 10% public housing. Why so low?
I knew I'd get this. I got warned that many people in Canberra will be cranky if it's anything less than 100% public housing. We've eyeballed 10% public housing and 10% social housing. So, and I'm certain this crowd knows, but the public housing is where you pay 25% of your income, and the social housing is where you pay 75% of market rent. So that's 20% of those two models. There's no particular science over why we identified that amount. We sort of thought, that's probably going to be maybe 800 to 1,000 public and social homes. It's quite a lot. There is a certain point at which we use salt and pepper for our public housing, which means we distribute it so that you don't get the giant estates and some of the social problems and some of the stigma that can come with that. So I like whether 10% is the magic number, whether it should be 12% or 15%. Like when if we went ahead with this plan, you would actually work that out. And I would say the most public and social housing we could get on the site that leads to great outcomes for everybody living there is the right number. But we've just started with 10% plus 10%.
Okay. The important bit, I think, is to redefine public housing for essential workers. Sue, you are muted. How unusual.
Thank you, Jochen. Thank you, Joe. I'd like to raise another aspect of public interest and amenity that relates directly to both your responsibilities of planning and planning and transport. And this is these are issues that have been raised in many ways since about 2018 around here in meetings, in submissions, in discussions, in inputs to state development plans and all that sort of thing. And nobody has really been prepared to answer the questions that we've raised. We've had an inkling of an answer on one aspect, but I'll raise that in a minute. And the question is about what you're suggesting is basically a population in one space that is about the size of 3 existing suburbs. We're having another suburb built at Canberra, just very close to the racetrack. So the DV's all gone through for that. We've got another suburb and a half being built on the strip along Northbourne Avenue at Yuwani, with no public or social housing involved, I might say. That involves 17 multi-storey buildings and about 60 townhouses. So you've got sort of another 3,000 to 4,000 people there. The same at Canberra. You've got 10,000 potentially at the racetrack. Even if it doesn't go through and the racing club gets what they want, that's another 3,000 to 5,000 people. Okay. The question is, what work have you done to look at how light rail efficiency, comfort and access and convenience can be delivered and maintained for existing residents of the inner north? And that's from Randwick Road, say, down to Civic and all the rail stops there, and the 7 buses that disgorge people at the Dixon interchange. How are existing residents and the equivalent of about 3 or 4 new suburbs in the densified areas going to be served by light rail, which is already crowded at peak hours? It's hot, smelly, uncomfortable. You can't fit many bikes on. How would people anywhere from Dixon interchange on to Civic even get on the light rail? Now, some of us raised this with officials in transport in about 2018, and there was a mumbling made about the possibility of starting light rail carriages at the Dixon interchange. So you have empty ones going forward to Civic at peak hours, or maybe even more often outside of those hours. But the rail is already operating at 5-minute intervals. There's a lot of intersections. From what I've read, you probably can't really add many more rail services on the Gungahlin to Civic run in peak hours without getting bunching up. That's intersections, and which would then increase the travel time incredibly. Now, I'd like to know what research you've done on how light rail can support the population you're talking about, plus all the other big populations that are coming between the racecourse and the Northbourne Anthill Street intersection, and bearing in mind that Downer also has a very large number of infill spaces marked for densification under the new district strategy. So what work have you done on this? What discussions have you had with TCCS to try and drag out of them perhaps what the outlook is for the poor travelling public? Because existing people need to know this. People who want to move anywhere near light rail or get a bus, even though they don't go very often anymore, might want to know. And people who might want to downsize along the corridor would need to know this. And you can't get answers from anybody. The district strategy very poorly simply says, in terms of initiatives, a long-term initiative is to investigate options for increasing capacity of the public transport network across the inner north district to relieve demand pressures in advance of future population growth, which is already happening. It's not future, it's happening now, including the northbound corridor linkages. That's on page 34 of the Inner North District Strategy. So developers, the private developers are very quick to just fob off active travel and public transport issues in their DAs and EDPs. They say things like public transport via the nearest bus interchange at Dixon and light rail stations is excellent.
Can you come to end with your question, please?
The question is, what have the Greens done to research public transport demand and supply issues to make their plans at the racecourse feasible and without affecting the amenity of residents, new and existing, further down between there and Civic?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and it would be an area where we'd have to do a lot more work to go ahead. But I can probably give you a better answer than you've already got from the district strategy. Light rail is meant to be really easy to scale. Government's probably already made some mistakes on this one. The platforms need to be built longer so that you can add more carriages on, but you can add more carriages on, so they're going to have to extend the platforms, which they should have done from the start, and add more carriages so that each light rail service going can actually be expanded quite easily. So that's one way that you would do it. There is a certain amount where you can't put in more services, but we haven't reached capacity services yet, I understand. So you can also add more frequency of services. Active travel is really a really important piece of the picture, particularly when you're talking about a site that's only 5 kilometres away from Civic. We've got a whole lot of research that shows for distances 5 kilometres and less, lots and lots of people will use active travel, cycling and e-bikes now, if you build separated infrastructure properly, and if you have, like we've got laid out here, a really fully walkable, rideable place all round. Obviously, there's some people in the population that are never going to ride or that can't walk long distances. But if you get as many people as you can into active travel, that helps. So that's probably the work that we do. And also where you need more services and where you have people coming not on the light rail corridor, we'd have a lot more buses. We've actually got fewer buses now than we had in 1990. The Greens would invest much more in buses and would roll out light rail quicker, but also, do some of those things like make the platforms bigger and invest in it to work. That's my quick answer. And I think I'm conscious that May hasn't spoken yet, so I'll wrap it up there, but chase me up if you want more on that, because we've been looking at public and active transport quite a lot.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Ian, I'm conscious of time, and I've asked Mai whether it's okay with her that she starts talking at 8. So we've got about 10 minutes left for this discussion. Ian, you are muted. Terminally.
How did that go?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, there was a banner over my demute. Look, thanks, Joe, for that presentation. It was really good. Just 2 quick questions, and one's going to lean into May's presentation. Was considering the likely community support for this master plan and reclamation of that site for better use, how can the NCCC help to get that decision making and community involvement in that decision in front of that steering committee? And I think we're all excited when there was a plan B in the district plan, which evaporated. So we'd like to figure out how to get plan B back on the agenda. And that's something that Joachim's driven Joachim mad for, the last 12 months. The second one was, have you thought in the plan, in that master plan, of including government-owned build-to-rent properties, which would cross-subsidise public housing, which makes a significant loss. And I just think that's an opportunity, instead of government trying to get the private sector this is probably going to be in May's presentation, but how you can get that cross subsidisation. We've always tried to get the private sector in to build to rent, but they get to almost to the line and then they fall over, as we saw in corner of Northbourne and Wakefield, that massive opportunity for build to rent. So just those two questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Ian. That's a great question on advocacy. You guys do an amazing job of advocacy. I reckon it would be a prime time to write to the Chief Minister and ask him his intentions for the steering committee and ask him, you know, what plans they're considering and what their timeline is. We'll be doing the same in Parliament, but it's so important for this stuff to come from community. And I reckon do any media and community advocacy or a petition could be really useful too. My greatest fear is that decisions will get made hastily behind closed doors without the community getting dialed in, and that things will get decided. It'll be too late for people to get dialed in. So I actually think speaking up now is really, really important. I'll confess, we know that we wanted public and community housing in there. We hadn't really thought through other things like build to rent. It's certainly worth considering. Rebecca Vassarati has been leading our public housing and our housing package, and she's done a lot more thinking than I have, and May has a lot more expertise in this area than I have on whether that's a good commercial model. One of the things that the Greens would do differently that would make public housing more financially sustainable long term is we want to buy and build 10,000 public homes over the next 10 years. That gets you up to the point where you are no longer you have a much broader range of tenants living in those places, paying their 25% of their income. So you actually have a more financially sustainable fund coming in to maintain the stock. And it also it's much more like how we did housing in the 80s. It gets us closer to the kind of housing stock we had and the different sorts of people living in that housing stock to make it financially sustainable long term. But build to rent, I'll gallop back and ask my expert friends whether we would want to include build to rent in there.
Thanks for that.
Yeah.
Thanks, Joe. And thanks for this interesting discussion. And there would be much more to look at for the moment. But your suggestions of what we can do, we will take that up and see how we go. The main other point I would like to make is that the only planning instrument that has been suggested to tackle housing choice and urban densification is zoning changes. And that is an agonizingly slow and probably completely ineffective way of densification of an existing city. So one other argument for making use of places like Thoroughbred Park, but also huge areas of surface car parks in Canberra, is that this actually would allow a planned densification effort, including prime places for public housing, that would in a way be the sign of good planning. And we don't see good planning at the moment in that respect, yeah, in the large picture.